And so when I hear people, quite rightly complaining about how awful slavery was, I wish they would give our country some credit for taking the lead in abolishing it and ensuring that it stayed abolished.
I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts put on by us at the Centre for Independent Studies on issues around, liberalism, classical liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses, challenges, and its history. And I'm delighted today to have with me what I hope will be the first of a series of two special podcasts, Simon Heffer. Simon is a columnist for the Daily Telegraph in the United Kingdom, but more importantly, Professor of Modern British History at the University of Buckingham, and the author of a number of books on the history of Great Britain and Ireland from the Victorian era right up until the beginning of the Second World War, entitled High Minds, The Age of Decadence, Staring at God, and then more recently, Singing as We Go. He also has interest in words, and his latest book is Scarcely English, an A to Z assaults on our language. We may talk about that in another podcast. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
We're here to talk about liberalism, and I've discovered in this podcast that it's a very loose term. You like precision in words. What do you mean by it?
Well, I think of it as classical liberalism. I don't think of it in the sense that Americans now use it as a synonym for leftism.
Right.
And in my own country, liberalism, I suppose, originates with great thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, people such as David Hume, John Locke, Adam Smith. And a liberal party comes into being in Britain after the 1832 Reform Act. They were called Whigs until then, and some of the more aristocratic members thought of themselves as Whigs for quite a long time afterwards. And the differences between Whigs and Tories, the Tories being the other side, really goes back to the English civil wars of the mid-17th century.
Well, how do you understand liberalism emerged then? It is an English phenomenon, a Great British phenomenon to start with, isn't it?
Well, one reason why a Liberal Party emerged in Britain in the 1830s after the Reform Act, which had extended the franchise considerably, was there was a great debate about protectionism versus free trade. And the Tories at that stage were great protectionists. They'd introduced the Corn Laws, which put tariffs on imported cereals, in order to protect the fortunes of aristocratic landed Tory peers. And they were starving, effectively, a lot of the poorer British people who were paying an unnaturally high price for their food. Many liberals understood that it would be better to liberate those poor people from unnecessarily high food prices. But some of them also suspected, and they turned out to be right, that by engaging in free trade rather than protectionism, they would boost British industry broadly. And they did when it came about. But there was this long debate that lasted from really the late 1820s through until 1846, when the Corn Laws were finally repealed, about whether they should be repealed. And the Liberals were on the right side of the argument. However, it was a Conservative Prime Minister, Robert Peel, who led the policy, and it got voted through by the Liberals in the House of Commons in Britain and by a minority of Tories. But the Tory who, and a brilliant man, who advised him to consider repeal of the Corn Laws, not least to avoid mass famine in Ireland, with people starving to death during the potato famine, was Gladstone.
William Gladstone.
William Gladstone. And he started off, he became an MP very young. He was 22, I think, when he became an MP in 1832. And he was a government minister when Peel came into power. He was still only in his early 30s. But one of the greatest intellects in the history of British politics. And he managed to persuade Peel that repealing the Corn Laws was the best way to solve a terrible tragedy in Ireland. And Peel did it in the teeth of opposition from most of his own party. This begins a tradition, by the way, of people who are notionally conservatives, who embrace liberal economics, which is, of course, what Mrs. Thatcher did nearly 150 years later.
And it's here the issue of tariffs is all on the world again, as though nothing's been learnt.
Yes, I mean, I've asked various economic historians. I'm not an economic historian, although I'm a historian who's very interested in economics, whether any of them can tell me, give me an example of a protectionist regime that has improved the economy of the country imposing it. And they struggle, because there's always retaliation.
Yes.
I mean, we've seen this already with Trump's attempts to impose it on, on China.
Now, can I go back first to the 18th century to start with, or maybe a bit earlier, how liberal ideas first evolved?
Well,
that's probably the 17th century, I think. I really go back, I don't know.
Yeah, the English civil wars were largely fought over the notion of what we would now consider liberal ideas being allowed to pertain in British society, or English society, because the union of the crowns hadn't happened by then with Scotland. It was Charles I who had tried to impose his will on Parliament, and Parliament, which had been enriched by a new middle class that came out of the prosperity of Tudor England, wasn't going to be told to do what to do by the king. And of course the king prorogued Parliament in, I think, 1630. It didn't come back for nearly a decade. And this caused great anger among people who felt a basic need to have some form, I wouldn't say of democratic rights, because there was no democracy, but of civil rights exercised through Parliament. So that's where it really starts. There was also a big question about religion. The Reformation had been imposed by Henry VIII on England, in the 16th century. The Church of England was founded in 1534 for the cynical reason to allow him to marry his mistress largely, but nonetheless that's when it came about. And through the operation of Protestantism in Britain over the next 100 years, this famous Protestant work ethic came about, and this was the means by which you couldn't buy your way into heaven, really. You had to do good works. You needed money to do that, and by that means you could buy your way into heaven. But the Roman Catholic Church took a very different view, that you were ordained from birth really to be where you were and how you were, and it was going to be very difficult for you to move your station.
So there was a religious dimension to the rise of liberalism.
Yes, I mean the predominance of Protestantism in Britain after 1534 created a much more mercantile society, and a society that had a lot of social mobility. Edward VI, during his very brief reign, he reigned from 1547 to 1553, on the advice of his ministers, founded a large number of grammar schools around Britain, which were aimed to give this new middle class a relatively cheap place to educate their children, so that the intellectual base of England would expand.
And is there a reason why it's the Scottish Enlightenment where ideas really come to the fore towards the end of that century?
Yes, I mean there was a lot of activity around the universities in Scotland, such as St Andrews and Edinburgh, in the 18th century. We only had two universities in England. We had Oxford and Cambridge, and they were mainly there for the training of clergy. That was their principal job really up until the 19th century. Whereas the Scots were much more intellectually curious, and of course philosophy was discussed at Oxford and Cambridge, but it wasn't discussed in the same way that it was in Scotland, much more lively and far-reaching.
Also, I'm not mistaken, Scotland at that stage had very high literacy rates.
Very high, and the Scots always believed in education in a way that the English didn't. I mean, Thomas Carlyle, of whom I once wrote a biography, who was the son of what he was called a peasant from Annandale on the English-Scottish border, used to walk 74 miles to Edinburgh every academic year to study at the university from the age of 14, and would then walk back again. He would live largely on oats while he was there. He didn't have very much money, but he got an absolutely stunning education. And the Scots always not only took education more seriously than the English, but they wanted it not to be exclusive to the aristocratic and the upper middle classes. And that's another reason why they led the world in thought. You know, I mean, their greatest achievement, in my view, was giving the world Adam Smith.
Tell me about Adam Smith.
Well, Adam Smith, of course, was the author of The Wealth of Nations.
Yes, and the moral sentiments too.
Yes, and Adam Smith effectively invented liberal economic theory in the 1770s, and he lived in Kirkcaldy in Scotland, and he recognised ways of improving the economy, such as through division of labour, but he understood that you had to control the supply of money, and if you had too much money chasing too few goods, then you get inflation. The price would go up. And these are lessons that were, as I say, over 200 years later, fundamental to Thatcherism and to her ideas about how to get the British economy out of the mess it was in the 1970s.
The early Liberals were opposed by forces of reaction. What sort of forces, where were they coming from? Was that just self-interest, or was it something else?
It was largely the landed interest in England.
Okay.
And in Scotland, after the Union of the Crowns. After the Napoleonic Wars, Lord Liverpool's government brought in protectionism, as I've said, and artificially inflated the price of food, which wasn't a problem for the aristocrats who were benefiting from it, but it was a great problem for people who hadn't got any money and who couldn't afford to feed their families properly. And although things were bad in Ireland by the 1840s, there were also quite a lot of riots in England, and the Chartists, of course, set up their movement, which was even more, it was really proto-socialist more than liberal, and you know, they wanted universal suffrage, they wanted regular parliaments, they wanted a welfare state, they wanted all sorts of things that we now take for granted in the 21st century in Western democracies. And there was this great fight by the 1840s, by them, by liberals, against the forces of reaction, as you correctly put it, who were embraced almost entirely by the Conservative Party.
What impact did the American and then the French Revolution have on the growth of liberalism? Or did it scare them?
The American Revolution of 1776 and thereafter was humiliating for Britain, because we lost what we thought was our empire. We had another one coming along. We didn't understand that.
No.
Of course, Captain Cook had got here about 6 years earlier, and the first fleet arrived 12 years after the American independence. But we didn't know that then. So that was humiliating rather than worrying. The French Revolution was worrying. Burke famously wrote about this in his reflections on the revolution in France, where he said
this is Edmund Burke, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where he said, who's portrayed as a great conservative thinker, and of course he is, but he had great liberal tendencies. And I can't remember the quote exactly, but he says in the reflections on the revolution in France that if your neighbour's house is on fire, it doesn't do any harm for the hose to play on your own house a bit to stop the fire spreading. And he was very concerned that the flames from Paris in the early 1790s might leap across the channel. But they didn't. And I think the reason they didn't was that English society in particular, but British society generally, was not like French society. We didn't by that time have a peasantry in England. We had an agricultural labouring class that over the next few years would begin to be picked off by the Industrial Revolution and internal migration to great industrial centres, mainly in the north of England. But we didn't have that peasant class that was patronised and treated pretty badly by an aristocracy. The British aristocracy, I don't want to romanticise it, but it did have a sense of what the French call noblesse oblige. It had a sense that it had to look after its people, not least because it relied on those people to work for it, to till its soil and to keep its estates going. And if those people got ill or became disaffected, the estate wouldn't be run very well. And so they were, to an extent, looked after. And that, I think, is what spared us having a revolution. And then, of course, when the Napoleonic Wars broke out in the 1790s, and they lasted, of course, up until Waterloo in 1815, we had a spasm of great patriotism where Liberals or Whigs and Tories united to see off the common enemy, which was Napoleon. And I think we did that relatively well. It was only after we'd beaten Napoleon, when he'd met his Waterloo, that the Corn Laws were introduced, and a real division grew up in society between those who could feed themselves and those who couldn't.
It was as simple as that.
Yeah, and the liberal interest took the side of the have-nots.
Yeah, there was a great, you mentioned the Reform Act, there was a great movement. In fact, you called your discussion of the Victorian era high minds. It was a time of high-minded reform. Tell me a bit about why that was. We often today look back a long distance to Victoria and we think of a very different view, but you painted it as a place of significant reform and significant liberal achievements.
There were two leaders of this. I mean, I mentioned Gladstone, and he was one of them. He was an immensely enlightened man. He was a devout Christian, a devout Anglican, and he felt the need to do the right thing for the mass of people. He joined the Conservative Party when he became an MP in his 20s, really for family reasons. His family had always been Conservatives or Tories. But he left the Tory party. I mean, he left it after the Corn Laws were repealed. He wasn't popular because of the role he'd played in it. Peel had to resign as Prime Minister. There was a Liberal administration that lasted until into the 1850s. But Gladstone found himself naturally aligning by the late 1850s with the government of Lord Palmerston. And he was Palmerston's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He then served in the Liberal government of Lord John Russell, or Lord Russell as he'd become by that stage, and formed his own administration in 1868, which was one of the great reforming administrations in history. And so he's one of the great figures of advancing liberalism. The other one, oddly enough, was Prince Albert.
The Prince Consort.
The Prince Consort. Prince Albert was very keen on improving the lot of the poor, and he made a speech, I think it was in 1847, when he opened some new, by the standards of the day, quite nice working people's dwellings in London. And he made a speech where he said, we've got to move on. We've now found the means to reduce the price of food and to improve everything. And there was an attempt the following year, in 1848, of the Chartists to hold a great rally at Kennington, near where Australia play cricket now at the Oval when they come to England. There was supposed to be a big rally there in April 1848, and the authorities were terrified by this. They enlisted thousands of men as special constables, and the streets were lined with them. But when these people turned up, there were very few of them, and it was a damp squib. And that was because in the 2 years since the Corn Laws had been repealed, the whole mood of the country had changed, and liberalism had prevailed. People, even those without the vote, had been convinced that they were now being governed by people who understood much more clearly what the realities of their lives were like. And the old aristocratic caste, who had treated them like serfs, had gone into retreat. And when we next got a Conservative government, a proper Conservative government, a long-term one, which was under Disraeli in the 1870s, 1874, it was a government that sought to continue the reform programme. So liberalism had deeply influenced the way that Conservatives thought in Britain as well by that stage.
You mentioned reform. What kind of reforms were there?
Well,
you said many reforms.
Disraeli was pressured by public opinion when there was a Conservative government under Lord Derby between 1867 and 1868 to having another Reform Act. The Russell administration had been defeated on a Reform Act which caused outrage in the country, And the Reform Act that Disraeli, as leader of the House of Commons, ended up bringing in was far more liberal, with a greater extension of the franchise, than anything Russell and Gladstone had contemplated.
What kind of things are reforming on their mind?
Well, it was just the classes of people to whom they extended the vote.
The vote, you mentioned that, yes.
So that was the first thing. So you enfranchised and gave political power to a pretty large class of people who'd never had the vote, and this caused horror among Tories. But also there were, in the Gladstone administration of 1868, he introduced the availability of universal education. It wasn't compulsory, it became compulsory in 1902, but there was going to be a school place for every child up to the age of 12. There was a series of factory acts that limited how long children could work, how long men and women could work. I mean, one of the first great reforms in the 1840s was to ban women from going down coal mines because they felt the work was too dirty and horrible for them, and they just shouldn't be there. So there were reforms of the workplace, of education, and also by the time Disraeli gets into power, he introduces a very important measure, or rather his Home Secretary Richard Cross introduces it, called the Artisans' Dwellings Act of 1876. And this gave local councils the power to purchase and knock down insanitary housing and to build better housing.
And of course this follows the reform of the 1830s, which was extended the franchise, and things like the abolition of slavery, firstly in the 18...
Well, Wilberforce's first act was to get slavery abolished in the British Empire.
Yes, that's right.
And that was in 1807.
Right.
And then the trade involving anyone from Britain was abolished in 1833. And we led the world on that.
In fact, the Royal Navy was out there enforcing.
Yes, it was. Yes. And so when I hear people, quite rightly complaining about how awful slavery was, I wish they would give our country some credit for taking the lead in abolishing it and ensuring that it stayed abolished.
Because, and I don't want to spend too long on this now, but because it was just taken from most people as obvious, since all empires and civilizations had some form of slavery from time immemorial.
Yeah.
But suddenly, in England, people thought they could change. This is part of this spirit of reform that seemed to be swept the 19th century.
Yes. I mean, also, I think, I can't remember the exact figure, there were over 100 offences in about 1840 for which you could be hanged. In fact, you weren't hanged for more than about 3 or 4, and mainly murder and very serious crimes such as that. But the death penalty was reformed, and its availability was greatly reduced. So that's another liberal measure.
You mentioned the economics, but something seems to be going on in the moral consciousness of the nation to make these things suddenly, things that were taken for granted as the way the world has to be, are suddenly thought, no, they are intolerable, we should change them.
Yeah.
What's going on?
The economic advances of the 17th and 18th century, building on what had happened in Tudor times with the advent of Protestantism, had created a very substantial middle class right the way across Britain. And if you to this day, you go to any British town and you will see the evidence of Georgian 18th century housing in most, not all, but most British towns. And that is evidence of the strong middle class that existed there nearly 300 years ago. And that middle class was brought up to be quite religious. There was a massive church building program in Britain in the 18th and, for different reasons, in the 19th century after industrialization. And that middle class was prevailed upon to be more considerate of people who did not have its privileges. Also, there were the great men such as Cobden and Bright, who were both liberals, who led the Corn Law League. They had also, Cobden certainly was an industrialist, and they had an idea that by trying to find ways to innovate and maximize profits, you would be able to put people's wages up, and there would be create wealth and to share that wealth out. And there was very much a regime in 19th century Britain where there was very little taxation, and only very wealthy people paid taxes, and the state was kept as small as possible.
Even though at the same time the state is reforming and economic and moral life even.
Yeah, but it's a small state, and there is an idea, and it's a moral idea, that the state doesn't get involved. And I mean, to leap forward a bit to 1912, when Asquith is Prime Minister, and he's a Liberal Prime Minister, and rather a great one in my view, there was a very, very difficult set of strikes going on in 1911, 1912. Ramsay MacDonald called it the Great Unrest. And there was a particularly irreconcilable coal strike. Now, coal, which we now all hate, was the basis upon which Britain and every other developed country in the world existed. All the factories were powered by coal. Electricity, which had only just started, was powered by coal.
Transportation by coal?
Well, the Royal Navy and merchant shipping was powered by coal.
Railways?
And railways were powered by coal. So you couldn't really get out of bed in the morning without coal. And there was a miners' strike, and the country was about to grind to a standstill. And Asquith got up in the House of Commons and, to his great reluctance, announced that he was going to allow a civil servant to go and meet the coal owners and the coal miners' leaders and talk about whether they could reach some sort of reconciliation. This was the first time in British history that a government had ever involved itself with what was going on in the relations between master and servant. And Asquith, as a classical liberal, a man who'd learned everything from Gladstone, was so distraught that he'd had to do this, that he was in tears at the dispatch box, because he felt he was compromising one of the most fundamental liberal principles of all, about the state keeping out.
You said it was a moral principle to be a small state. What's moral about a small government?
Well, what's moral about it is it doesn't entail interference by third parties in the lives of individuals, such as, if two sides in an industrial dispute can't reconcile it, they suddenly have imposed upon them a civil servant to tell them what to do. But also the morality of not taking large amounts of people's earnings from them in taxation in order to fund a state bureaucracy or
so
apparatus.
Respecting people's liberty.
Yeah.
Although you also mentioned some of the reforms certainly imposed obligations upon employers who they could employ. It wasn't free for all, laissez-faire, was it?
No, it wasn't free for all, but there's a very good case that can be made for all the restrictions that liberalism brought in. The trouble is, by the time you get to the early 20th century or late 19th century, liberalism is starting to smell a little bit of what's going to be called socialism.
Yes, I want to come to that in just a minute, yes.
Yeah.
Socialism comes after liberalism. Did liberalism succeed in the 19th century, making England a better place?
It made it a much richer place. And one of the great liberals we haven't discussed was Joe Chamberlain, who became mayor of Birmingham in the 1870s.
Tell me about him.
And he brought in a large number of local reforms to make the lives of ordinary people in Birmingham that much more comfortable and happier. But he did so at the same time as encouraging local business and enterprise by keeping out of it and not taxing it, not levying a huge local rate on it. And that was an example of a local liberal politician trying to do the right thing for people and not getting steeped in some sort of socialist fantasy that he can make everything better.
Did 19th century liberals have a sense, therefore, of progress and of and optimism? Because it seems to me they're trusting people.
They certainly had a sense of optimism. Whether they would have called it progress, I don't know.
Right.
But they certainly felt they were going about a business that was helping create wealth, helping to enrich the country, helping to improve the country, helping to improve standards of living. And this is absolutely apparent. If anyone looks at his or her family history, they will see that at the beginning of the century, quite often branches of their family will have had only about 3 or 4 children who survived to adulthood. and often up to 7 or 8 who died before the age of 5 or 6. By the end of the century, you've got these vast families of 8, 10, 12 children, because they're all better nourished, they're living in more sanitary conditions. They've discovered, for example, by that stage that cholera is a waterborne, not an airborne disease. So sanitation has been improved everywhere. And the population has risen, I think in 100 years, from something like just over 10 million to about 40 million, as a result of the great improvements in people's lives. And most of that can be attributed to the policies of liberals who wanted to make things better.
At the time of a great growth in knowledge.
Yeah.
Because if I'm not mistaken, incomes, GDP, or if I put that, income was quite flat until the 18th and 19th century, when suddenly there's this remarkable, what's called the first and second industrial revolution changes.
Yeah, and the other great thing that happens in Britain in that century, and Gladstone did in the 1840s much of the legislation to regulate it, not that it needed very much, were the railways. Now, these not only meant you could transport goods all the way around Britain much more effectively, and so that gave great commercial opportunities to everybody, whether you were shipping a piece of machinery up from London to Scotland on a train, or, for example, there were large parts of central England where people had never eaten fresh fish, because by the time it got from the sea, it had rotted. So people now started to get fresh fish for dinner or for breakfast. So that was a great change. But also it started the expansion of cities, and it bred a new middle class. And all the new industrial concerns needed a bureaucracy. They also needed financing. This is a time when the City of London grows enormously to reflect the growth of industrial England. And London expands enormously, with people coming in from outer suburbs on trains, places that were impossible to access central London or the City of London from. They now live 8 or 9 miles away, and they can get into central London in under half an hour. And so this creates a new middle class. It creates the commuter, which is slightly tedious, but there's a snowball effect.
Now, isn't there another side to this, that with the rapid industrialisation, for the poor, especially things that in the early stages, looks like they got worse, or is that, am I misunderstanding?
No, they were grim, and the way that many factories were run, particularly before the Factory Acts, were rather like workhouses, except people were paid, and you had children aged 6 or 7 going in there. I'd say Lord Shaftesbury, who was notionally a Tory, but was very concerned about the plight of people working in factories, was one of the great motive forces behind the Factory Acts. And then later on in the century, as I say, they bring in the availability of schooling, and there's no compulsion at that stage, but people are encouraged to send their children to school, and more of them do. And that really increases the potential of the nation, because you've suddenly got a larger number of people who are literate and numerate, and who can go into lower middle class white collar jobs, rather than just being a factory hand or working on the land.
We've talked about the 19th century very much as what seemed to me as a liberal century, but towards the end, you just made a comment earlier that I want to come back to. You said socialism also becomes more and more attractive. How is that different from liberalism, and why is it becoming attractive?
Well, socialism becomes largely about the determination of socialists to intervene and control and to redistribute income and wealth. And the Liberals start doing this in 1894 in Rosebery's administration, after Gladstone has ceased to be Prime Minister. Sir William Harcourt, who was his Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduces death duties, and this horrifies the landed classes, almost all of whom, of course, are Tories. And they are shocked because when they die, their estates, a certain proportion of their estate, has to go to the government. And they just can't hand it all on to their eldest son as they would have done before. So that's an example of intervention and upsetting an old social order. And it's something that Gladstone didn't really contemplate. Rosebery went along with it, but it shows a move to the what we would now call the left. And then when you get into the Asquith administration, Lloyd George decides to bring in quite high taxation, although low by today's standards, of people who are earning large salaries or have large incomes. And this causes the House of Lords in November 1909 to defeat the government on a finance bill for the first time in 200 years since the reign of Queen Anne. And that unleashes all sorts of other problems with the Parliament Act and heaven knows what else.
We had to freeze the business in 1909. I want to talk next time. We talk about what happens in the 20th century with the end of the Liberal Party in its name form, and the story of the next 100 years. So, Hugh, thank you very much for this time. This is just the first of a two-part series with my guest Simon Heffer discussing liberalism in United Kingdom. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for watching.